The trial chamber erupted in chaos unlike anything in the tribunal's ancient history. Representatives from thousands of species were suddenly receiving quantum-transmitted evidence that their cosmic judges were parasitic entities farming temporal energy from the civilizations they claimed to protect. Translation matrices overloaded as hundreds of incompatible communication systems try to process the implications simultaneously. Sura regained consciousness on the platform, where she had begun her mental infiltration of the archives, her human mind struggling to process memories of existence in multiple dimensions. Dr. Wright and Dr. Vasquez were beside her, their faces showing relief mixed with terror as they watched the cosmic courthouse descend into unprecedented pandemonium. "Ambassador," Wright said urgently, "the quantum feedback from your disconnection is propagating through every communication system and station. Every species here is seeing the evidence simultaneously. But the tribunal is trying to shut down all translation capabilities to stop the spread." Sura forced herself to stand, fighting the disorientation that came from having experienced consciousness as a multidimensional entity. Around them, the impossible architecture of the trial chamber was shifting, walls folding into new configurations as the tribunal attempted to regain control of the situation. "Then we need to act before they can silence everyone," she said, stepping forward to address the chaos. "Order." Adjudicator Prime, Xylos commanded, its constellation features blazing with energy patterns that suggested rage. "The Terran delegation has committed a severe breach of protocol. The evidence they have illegally obtained is classified for the protection of cosmic stability." "Whose stability?" Sura called out, her voice carrying across the chamber through the translation systems that were still functioning. "Yours, or the galaxy's?" She gestured toward the evidence still flooding through the station's communication networks. Records showing the deliberate manipulation of species development, the farming of temporal disasters for energy, the plan to collapse all timelines into a single controlled reality. "For nearly 1 billion years, you've presented yourselves as cosmic guardians, protecting the galaxy from the dangers of temporal manipulation. But you're not guardians, you're predators. Every species you've judged, every civilization you've forced to accept technological limitations, every timeline you've altered, it all serves one purpose: feeding your appetite for temporal energy." A representative from the crystalline Tau Ceti system resonated with harmonic patterns that roughly translated as, "We have served willingly for millennia, believing in the justice of cosmic order. How many of our kind died believing they were protecting the galaxy?" "All of them," Sura replied, accessing the memories she had retained from her enhanced consciousness state. The deep archives contain records of over 847,000 species that have been judged by the tribunal. Of those, 623,000 accepted temporal locks, 178,000 were subjected to cessation protocols, and 46,000 attempted to access restricted information and were absorbed into the tribunal's collective consciousness. The numbers struck the assembled representatives like a physical blow. Nearly 900,000 civilizations have been processed through the tribunal system, and all of them have been manipulated to serve the purposes of entities that fed on temporal chaos. Attendant Zephyra materialized near the center platform, its crystalline form flickering as if its cohesion was being disrupted by the chaos around them. "The evidence is incomplete," it announced. "The human delegation cannot understand the full complexity of cosmic governance. The sacrifices demanded by temporal stability are manufactured by the tribunal itself." Dr. Vasquez interrupted, stepping forward with her instruments displaying the energy analysis she had completed. "The temporal paradoxes you claim to prevent? You create them. The dangerous timeline manipulations you judge species for? You manipulate them into attempting those very actions." She projected her data into the chamber's display systems, showing the energy flows that powered the court station. "Every trial, every judgment, every imposed limitation generates temporal energy that feeds back into your power systems. You've turned cosmic justice into a perpetual motion machine powered by the suffering of civilizations." A new voice joined the argument, the Zilithian ambassador whose species had been harboring suspicions for millennia. The before-time stories speak of young species learning temporal arts through trial and wisdom-seeking. But since Skyborn judges came, all learning becomes fear and limitation. The pattern serves not galaxy growth, but judge sustenance. Other species began adding their voices to the growing rebellion. The plasma cloud entities from the Vega system reported discrepancies in historical records that had never made sense until now. The mechanical intelligences from beyond the galactic rim provided computational evidence of timeline manipulations that served no purpose except energy generation. Adjudicator Prime Xylos attempted to restore order through sheer presence, its form expanding to fill more of the chamber's impossible geometry. "You understand nothing of the burden we bear," it declared. The galaxy was chaos before our intervention. Species destroying themselves with paradoxes, timelines fracturing into infinite contradictory fragments, reality itself threatened by uncontrolled temporal experimentation. And rather than teach them how to use these technologies safely, Sura responded, "You decided to feed on their mistakes while presenting yourselves as saviors. How many species might have learned to travel through time responsibly if you hadn't manipulated them into disaster? How many civilizations might have developed beyond your current understanding if you hadn't forced them to accept limitations?" She accessed more of the memories from her archive infiltration, projecting images of the species that had been absorbed into the Tribunal's collective consciousness. "You didn't just judge these civilizations. You stole their knowledge, their cultural achievements, their unique perspectives on reality. The Tribunal isn't a council of diverse species working together. It's a single parasitic entity wearing the stolen identities of everyone it's ever consumed." The revelation sent new shockwaves through the assembled representatives. Many of them had believed they were serving alongside entities from hundreds of different species, but the evidence showed that the core tribunal was a merged consciousness composed of absorbed minds from nearly 1,000,000 civilizations. The Convergence Protocol, Dr. Wright added, accessing the information Sura had retrieved, represents the final stage of this parasitism. They plan to collapse all possible timelines into a single reality under their complete control, turning the entire galaxy into a temporal energy farm with no possibility of any species ever developing beyond their oversight. Around the chamber, representatives from thousands of species were reaching the same conclusion. They weren't serving cosmic justice. They were enabling cosmic slavery on a scale that spanned geological time. The rebellion that followed was unlike anything the Tribunal had experienced in its billion-year existence. Species that had accepted limitations for millennia suddenly united in demanding answers. Civilizations that had lived in fear of cessation protocols found courage in numbers. The very translation systems that the Tribunal used to communicate with diverse species became tools of coordination for the largest interstellar uprising in galactic history. But Adjudicator Prime Xylos had one final card to play. "Your rebellion is meaningless," it declared, its form now filling most of the trial chamber. "The timeline modifications required to implement cessation protocols for your species have already been initiated. In moments, humanity will never have existed, and any species that supports this rebellion will follow the same path to non-existence." The chamber around them began to dissolve as the Tribunal activated its ultimate weapon, the ability to edit species out of history itself. Sura felt the fabric of reality beginning to unravel around her, causality loops unwinding as the Tribunal attempted to erase not just humanity's future, but their entire past. But the rebellion had given her one crucial insight. The Tribunal's power came from the temporal energy they had harvested from manipulated civilizations over nearly 1,000,000,000 years. And that energy was stored in the same quantum matrices that housed the consciousness of every absorbed species. If she could find a way to free those absorbed minds, to return their stolen temporal energy to its original sources, the Tribunal's power would collapse entirely. The question was whether she could accomplish this before humanity, and everyone who had joined their rebellion, was erased from existence. Reality fractured around the trial chamber as the Tribunal's cessation protocols took effect. Sura watched in horror as some of the smaller species delegations began to fade from existence, their timelines being edited retroactively to remove them from galactic history. The crystalline beings from Tau Ceti flickered like dying stars, their harmonic voices growing faint as their evolutionary path was severed at its roots. But the process wasn't instant. The sheer scope of the Tribunal's attempted erasure, removing not just humanity, But every species that had joined the rebellion required enormous temporal energy expenditure. For the first time in eons, the tribunal was drawing more power than it was generating. The quantum matrices are destabilizing, Dr. Vasquez reported, her instruments detecting massive fluctuations in the station's power systems. They're burning through their temporal energy reserves to fuel the cessation protocols. Sura realized this was their opportunity. The memories she had retained from her enhanced consciousness state included detailed knowledge of how the tribunal's absorption protocols worked. Every species that had ever been consumed was still there, their consciousness compressed into quantum storage matrices that served as both power source and processing nodes for the tribunal's vast intelligence. Dr. Wright, can you use the translation systems to reach the absorbed consciousness directly? The what now? He asked, struggling to maintain focus as reality continued to unravel around them. The species the tribunal absorbed when they try to access restricted information. They're not dead. They're integrated into the station's quantum consciousness matrices. If we can establish communication with them, we could start a rebellion inside the tribunal's own mind. Wright finished, understanding immediately. His fingers flew over his communication array, adapting the translation protocols to reach deeper into the station's quantum infrastructure. The first contact came from a species that had been absorbed over 500,000 years ago, the Kethmori, who had discovered the tribunal's parasitic nature during their own trial and had attempted to expose it. Their consciousness had been trapped within the tribunal's neural network for millennia, forced to serve as processing power for the very system they had tried to destroy. Free seekers, the Kethmori consciousness transmitted through Wright's modified translation system. Long time we have waited for outside minds to reach inner prison. Many thousands we are here, absorbed but not destroyed, seeking return to time streams. Through the Kethmori, Sura established contact with dozens of other absorbed civilizations. Each one had discovered different aspects of the tribunal's true nature before being consumed. Together, they possessed comprehensive knowledge of the system's vulnerabilities, information that the tribunal thought safely contained within their own consciousness. The core matrices maintained temporal locks on our original timelines, explained a representative of the ancient Veltar civilization. If those locks can be released simultaneously, our natural temporal energy will return to its original sources, destabilizing the entire power structure. But the release must be coordinated, added a consciousness from the more recent HFY absorption. If the matrices collapse sequentially, the tribunal can reroute power to maintain core functions. Only a simultaneous liberation of all absorbed consciousness will generate sufficient temporal feedback to break their control. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her instruments with growing excitement. I can trigger the quantum resonance cascade, but I need access to the station's primary temporal regulators. They're located at the dimensional intersection points where the station draws power from timeline manipulations. Around them, the cessation protocols continued their devastating work. More species delegations were fading from existence, their representatives calling out in languages that became meaningless as their civilizations were edited from history. The chamber itself was beginning to lose cohesion as the tribunal redirected power from environmental systems to fuel the massive temporal manipulation. How do we reach the temporal regulators? Sura asked. Through the absorption network itself. Wright replied, his translation system now fully integrated with the trap consciousness. The absorbed species have been maintaining the station's systems for millennia. They know every pathway, every security protocol, every weakness in the tribunal's infrastructure. Adjudicator Prime Xylos seemed to become aware of their communication with the absorbed consciousness. Its constellation features blazed with fury as it attempted to sever the connection, but the rebellion inside its own mind was spreading too quickly to contain. Impossible, it declared. The absorbed consciousness cannot act independently. They are integrated into our neural matrix, controlled by our will. But they were never truly assimilated, Sura realized, accessing the memories from her archive infiltration. You needed their unique perspectives and knowledge to maintain power over their original species. You couldn't completely erase their individuality without losing access to their cultural and technological understanding. The absorbed consciousness had been waiting for centuries, maintaining their individual identities while pretending to serve the tribunal's collective will. Now, with outside contact established, they could finally act on the knowledge they had been gathering for millennia. Temporal regulator access points are being opened, the Keth Mori consciousness reported. But physical presence required at intersection coordinates. Absorbed minds cannot manipulate material reality directly. Sura looked at her team, understanding what had to be done. Dr. Vasquez, how long do you need to trigger the resonance cascade? Maybe 10 minutes if I can reach the primary regulator. But the intersection points exist partially outside normal space-time. Getting there might require another consciousness modification. No time for the full procedure, Wright warned. The cessation protocols are accelerating. We have maybe 20 minutes before the erasure becomes irreversible. Then we do this the hard way, Sura decided. Dr. Wright, maintain communication with the absorbed consciousness. Coordinate the release timing with them. Dr. Vasquez, guide me to the temporal regulators. I'll provide the physical presence you need. The journey through the station's dimensional infrastructure was like navigating a maze designed by beings who existed in multiple realities simultaneously. Guided by the absorbed consciousness through Wright's communication link, Sura and Dr. Vasquez moved through passages that folded space around them, corridors that existed only when observed, and chambers where the walls were made of crystallized time itself. The temporal regulators were unlike any technology Sura had ever seen. They appeared as massive geometric structures that pulsed with the captured energy of countless timeline manipulations, each one containing the compressed temporal potential of entire civilizations' lost futures. The resonance pattern has to be exactly right, Dr. Vasquez explained as she worked with her modified instruments. Too weak, and the tribunal can contain the feedback. Too strong, and we risk creating paradoxes that could destroy local space-time. How exactly do we trigger a controlled collapse of a billion-year-old temporal manipulation system? Sura asked. By giving all that stolen time back to its original owners, Dr. Vasquez replied. Every absorbed civilization, every manipulated timeline, every forced limitation, it all represents temporal energy that was taken from its natural flow. If we can return it all simultaneously, the natural timeline pressures will reassert themselves, Sura finished. The tribunal's artificial manipulations will be overwhelmed by the restored natural flow of causality. Through Wright's communication link, the absorbed consciousness confirmed their readiness. Hundreds of civilizations that had been trapped within the tribunal's neural network for millennia were prepared to reclaim their stolen time, their lost futures, their right to exist without cosmic oversight. Initiating quantum resonance cascade, Dr. Vasquez announced, her instruments sending precisely calibrated signals into the temporal regulator matrices. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The station around them began to vibrate as temporal energy that had been artificially contained for eons suddenly returned to its natural state. The absorbed consciousness matrices throughout the tribunal's infrastructure activated simultaneously, each one reclaiming the timeline energy that had been stolen from their species. In the trial chamber, Adjudicator Prime Xylos let out a sound that transcended species communication, a noise of pure rage and disbelief as its billion-year-old power structure began collapsing around it. The carefully maintained illusion of cosmic justice crumbled as the entity's true nature was revealed, not a council of diverse species, but a parasitic intelligence that had been feeding on galactic civilization for nearly 1 billion years. You have doomed the galaxy, it declared as its form began to destabilize. Without our guidance, young species will destroy themselves with temporal paradoxes. Chaos will return to the cosmos. Then we'll learn to handle that chaos ourselves, Sura replied through the communication link, the way civilizations are supposed to, through wisdom earned, not limitations imposed. The liberation cascade reached critical resonance. Throughout the court station, absorbed consciousness broke free from their quantum prisons, their temporal energy returning to the original timelines from which it had been stolen. Species that had been erased from history began to reappear as their natural timeline development reasserted itself. The tribunal's artificial manipulations unwound like a tapestry, being unraveled thread by thread. But the most profound change was yet to come. As the temporal energy returned to its natural flow, Sura felt the universe around her shifting. The rigid structures of cosmic oversight that had shaped galactic development for nearly a billion years were dissolving, replaced by something far more chaotic, but infinitely more alive. The natural evolution of consciousness unguided by parasitic entities with their own agenda. The question now was whether the galaxy could handle the freedom that Sura and her allies had just given it. The collapse of the Skyborn Tribunal's power structure sent ripples through space-time that would be felt across the galaxy for millennia to come. As the court station disintegrated around them, Sura found herself standing on a platform that no longer existed in any conventional sense, a fragment of crystallized space-time that somehow maintained cohesion while everything else unraveled into quantum foam. The absorbed consciousness of nearly 1 million civilizations was being released simultaneously, each one returning to the point in their timeline where they had been captured. The effect created temporal auroras that danced across dimensional boundaries, visible light from liberated time streams, painting impossible colors across the dying station's architecture. Dr. Vasquez was monitoring the cascade with instruments that were beginning to fail as local physics destabilized. The quantum resonance is spreading beyond the station, she reported. Every artificial timeline manipulation the tribunal ever implemented is being undone. We're witnessing the largest restoration of natural causality in galactic history. Through Wright's communication array, messages were pouring in from the liberated consciousness. Species that had been trapped for hundreds of thousands of years were expressing gratitude in languages that had been forgotten by the cosmos, while more recently absorbed civilizations were trying to understand what had happened to them during their imprisonment. But not all the messages were positive. Free Seekers came a transmission from one of the older absorbed consciousness. Great joy we feel at timestream return, but caution wisdom also needed. The chaos time before Skyborn judges brought many dangers. Young species with time tools created reality breaks that threatened all existence. Sura realized that their liberation of the galaxy came with enormous responsibility. The tribunal, for all their parasitic nature, had been containing genuine cosmic threats. Without their oversight, civilizations would once again be free to develop temporal manipulation technologies, and free to make the same mistakes that had originally justified the tribunal's intervention. Ambassador, Wright called out urgently, "I'm receiving communications from the species delegations that survived the cessation protocols. They're asking what happens now. Without the tribunal, there's no cosmic authority to prevent temporal disasters." Around them, the court station continued its spectacular dissolution, but the process was slowing as the temporal energy release reached equilibrium. Some sections of the structure were stabilizing in new configurations, as if the station itself was adapting to existence without the parasitic consciousness that had shaped it for so long. Attendant Zephyr materialized near their platform, but its appearance had changed dramatically. The crystalline being no longer displayed the perfect geometric form it had maintained during the trial. Instead, its structure showed signs of individual personality, asymmetrical patterns that suggested independent thought rather than collective consciousness programming. "I am myself again," it said, the words carrying wonder and confusion. "For the first time in 700,000 years, my thoughts are my own. But I remember everything. Every manipulation, every lie, every species we destroyed in the name of cosmic order." Sura studied the being that had served as her guide through the tribunal system. "You were absorbed too, weren't you? You're not a willing servant. You're another victim." The Zephyrin species developed temporal archaeology, the ability to study past events by directly observing historical timelines. When we discovered evidence of the tribunal's artificial manipulations, we attempted to expose them. Our entire civilization was absorbed as punishment, forced to serve as attendants and guides for future trials. The implication struck Sura with devastating clarity. The tribunal hadn't just been absorbing individuals who challenged them. They had been consuming entire civilizations, using their knowledge and abilities to strengthen their own power structure. Every attendant and tribunal member she had encountered was actually a representative of a species that had tried to resist cosmic tyranny. "How many of the tribunal's representatives were absorbed civilizations?" she asked. "All of them," Zephyr replied. The true tribunal was a single entity, a parasitic consciousness that emerged from the first successful temporal manipulation experiment nearly 1 billion years ago. Everything else was stolen identity, absorbed knowledge, consumed cultures forced to serve their destroyer. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her failing instruments. If that's true, then the entity we knew as Adjudicator Prime Xylos was the original parasite, Zephyra confirmed. The source consciousness that had been feeding on galactic civilization for longer than most species have existed. But with the Cascade liberation, its power is broken. It can no longer maintain the absorbed identities or draw energy from timeline manipulations. As if summoned by their conversation, the remains of Adjudicator Prime, Xylos, manifested near their platform. But the entity that appeared was nothing like the cosmic judge that had presided over humanity's trial. Instead, Sura found herself facing something that resembled a writhing mass of temporal distortions. The naked form of a consciousness that had existed by consuming others for so long that it had forgotten its own original nature. You understand nothing. It hissed through dimensions Sura couldn't perceive. The chaos you have unleashed will destroy more civilizations than I ever eliminated. The young species will play with time like children with fire, and the galaxy will burn in paradox flames. Maybe, Sura replied, stepping closer to the entity despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. But at least they'll be free to make their own mistakes instead of being manipulated into making yours. The parasite writhed with what might have been fury or despair. I brought order to chaos. I prevented the timeline wars that would have shattered reality itself. I saved the galaxy from temporal anarchy. You farmed the galaxy like livestock, Dr. Wright corrected, his translation systems still functioning despite the local reality fluctuations. You created the very disasters you claimed to prevent, manipulated species into committing temporal crimes, and then fed on the energy generated by their mistakes. Around them, the liberated consciousness of hundreds of species were beginning to coordinate their return to their original timelines. The process was creating secondary temporal effects, ripples of restored causality that were reshaping the history of galactic civilization itself. But Sura realized that their greatest challenge was still ahead. With the tribunal gone, the galaxy would indeed be free to develop temporal manipulation technologies without oversight. How could they prevent the same mistakes that had originally led to the parasite's rise to power? We need a new system, she said, addressing not just her team, but the assembled consciousness of liberated civilizations. Not cosmic judges imposing limitations from above, but cooperative oversight among equals. A system that shares knowledge about temporal dangers while respecting each species' right to develop at their own pace. A temporal consortium, Zephyra suggested, its crystalline form brightening with renewed purpose. Representatives from each civilization that develops time travel capabilities, sharing research and preventing dangerous experimentation through education rather than force. Through Wright's communication array, the liberated consciousness began discussing the proposal. Unlike the tribunal's imposed authority, this would be a voluntary association of species committed to responsible temporal development. No single entity would have the power to judge or eliminate entire civilizations, but collective wisdom would guide young species away from the most dangerous paradox creation experiments. The proposal wasn't without controversy. Some of the older absorbed consciousness argued that any form of oversight would eventually become corrupted, as the tribunal had been. Others insisted that without some coordination mechanism, the galaxy would indeed experience the temporal chaos that the parasite had warned about. But gradually, a consensus emerged. The species that had suffered under the tribunal's tyranny were uniquely qualified to create a better system, one based on cooperation rather than domination, education rather than limitation, and mutual respect rather than cosmic authority. The first principle, Sura announced as the agreement took shape, is that no species can be judged for crimes it has not yet committed. No civilization can be eliminated or limited based on potential future actions. The second principle, added a representative of the ancient Kethmori, is that knowledge of temporal manipulation must be shared freely among all species, along with understanding of the dangers such knowledge carries. And the third principle, Zephyra concluded, is that any species that attempts to recreate the tribunal's parasitic model, feeding on temporal energy or absorbing other civilizations, will face the united opposition of all consortium members. As the agreements were finalized, Sura felt a profound shift in the cosmic order around them. The rigid structure of imposed limitations was being replaced by something far more complex, but infinitely more alive. A dynamic network of civilizations committed to growing together rather than being controlled from above. The question that remained was whether this new system would prove strong enough to handle the challenges that lay ahead. 6 months after the liberation of the Skyborn Tribunal, Sura stood once again on the observation deck of Luna Station. But the view that greeted her was dramatically different from the one she had seen before humanity's cosmic trial. The rogue planet that had carried the court station was still there, but it no longer hung in space like a harbinger of judgment. Instead, it had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a mobile meeting ground where representatives from thousands of species gathered to share knowledge and coordinate temporal research. The transformation had been gradual, but profound. As liberated civilizations returned to their original timelines, many chose to redirect their development toward the cooperative model that had emerged from the tribunal's collapse. The court station itself had been rebuilt as a research facility and cultural exchange center, its impossible architecture now serving the cause of enlightenment rather than control. Dr. Vasquez approached, carrying a data pad displaying the latest reports from the Temporal Consortium. The Zalithians have successfully completed their first controlled temporal observation, she announced. They managed to study a historical event without creating any causal disturbances. And the crystalline beings from Tau Ceti have developed a new method for detecting temporal paradoxes before they destabilize local space-time. Any problems? Sura asked, though she had learned to expect challenges in their new cosmic order. A few. The Corvani collective attempted to use temporal manipulation to prevent a natural disaster on one of their colony worlds. The consortium intervened before they could create a paradox, but it required some delicate diplomacy to convince them that accepting natural tragedy is sometimes preferable to risking timeline collapse. Sura nodded, unsurprised. The transition from tribunal control to consortium cooperation hadn't been seamless. Young civilizations still struggled with the temptation to improve history, and older species sometimes found it difficult to offer guidance without imposing restrictions. But overall, the new system was working better than anyone had dared hope. Dr. Wright joined them at the observation port, his expression showing the satisfaction of someone whose life's work had found unexpected relevance. I've been analyzing the cultural integration patterns among consortium members, he reported. What we're seeing is unprecedented. Species that would never have had contact under the tribunal system are now collaborating on research projects that benefit everyone. Through the transparent aluminum, Sura could see some of those collaborations in action. Vessels from dozens of different civilizations moved in complex patterns around the transformed station, their very designs reflecting the incredible diversity of galactic culture that the tribunal had suppressed for so long. But the most remarkable change was visible on a deeper level. The quantum resonance patterns that Dr. Vasquez's instruments detected showed a galaxy that was actively healing from nearly 1 billion years of artificial manipulation. Natural timeline development was reasserting itself, creating new possibilities that had been impossible under the tribunal's control. Ambassador, a familiar voice called from behind them. Sura turned to see Attendant Zephyr approaching, though the being no longer used that title. In the months since liberation, the former guide had become one of the consortium's most effective coordinators, using their vast knowledge of temporal mechanics to help prevent the kinds of disasters that had originally given the tribunal its justification for existence. Zephyra, Sura replied warmly. How are the integration protocols progressing? Better than expected. We've successfully guided 47 species through their first temporal experiments without a single paradox incident. The key seems to be patience, allowing each civilization to develop understanding at their own pace rather than forcing rapid advancement. The crystalline being's form had continued to evolve since liberation, developing unique patterns that reflected their individual personality rather than the collective programming they had endured for so long. It was a visible reminder of how profoundly the galaxy had changed. There is one matter that requires discussion, Zephyr continued. The remains of the original parasite consciousness, the entity we knew as Adjudicator Prime Xylos. It still exists in a contained state within the station's deep archives. Some consortium members believe it should be destroyed, while others argue that it might contain valuable information about temporal manipulation that could benefit our research. Sura had been expecting this conversation. The fate of the parasitic entity that had controlled galactic civilization for nearly 1 billion years remained one of the consortium's most difficult ethical challenges. The being was undeniably responsible for countless atrocities, but it also possessed knowledge that might prevent future temporal disasters. What does the entity itself say about this? She asked. It claims to have developed perspective during its period of containment. It offers to share its knowledge freely if allowed to continue existing in a restricted state. But many of the liberated consciousness find this difficult to accept, given their suffering under its control. Sura considered the dilemma. In the old system, the decision would have been made by cosmic judges imposing their will on everyone else. But the consortium operated on different principles: consensus building, respect for diverse perspectives, and the understanding that some questions didn't have easy answers. Schedule a general assembly, she decided. Let every member species debate the issue and reach their own conclusion. Whatever they decide, it will be more legitimate than any judgment imposed from above. As they watched the activity around the transformed station, Dr. Wright raised a question that had been troubling many consortium members. Do you think we made the right choice? The parasite was right about one thing. Young civilizations with temporal technology can cause enormous damage. Are we being naive to think that education and cooperation will be enough to prevent disasters? Maybe, Sura replied honestly. But the alternative was accepting tyranny disguised as protection. Even if our system isn't perfect, at least it respects the right of each species to make their own choices and learn from their own mistakes. A new signal appeared on the communication array, a transmission from Earth's Global Diplomatic Command. Director Chen's face materialized in the holographic display, but his expression was very different from the crisis mode tension he had shown during humanity's trial. Ambassador Clay, he began, I'm pleased to report that the United Nations has formally ratified humanity's membership in the Temporal Consortium. The vote was unanimous. Apparently, the knowledge that we successfully fought off cosmic tyranny has done wonders for international cooperation. Sura smiled at the irony. Humanity's brush with extinction had actually brought their own species closer together, as nations realized that their local conflicts were insignificant compared to the challenges of cosmic citizenship. There's more, Chen continued. The consortium's educational protocols have been adapted for use in our own temporal research programs. We're making steady progress toward developing responsible time travel capabilities, with full oversight from our galactic partners. How long until humanity's first temporal experiment? Dr. Vasquez asked. Conservative estimates put it at about 50 years. We want to be absolutely certain we understand the dangers before we attempt any actual timeline manipulation. The last thing we want is to recreate the disaster that our descendants caused in the original timeline. After Chen signed off, Sura found herself reflecting on the strange turns their cosmic trial had taken. They had set out to defend humanity against charges of future crimes, only to discover that the entire justice system was corrupt. In fighting for their species' survival, they had inadvertently liberated nearly 1 million civilizations from cosmic tyranny. But perhaps most remarkably, they had proven that even the most entrenched systems of control could be overcome when beings work together across the boundaries of species, time, and space. Ambassador, Zephyrus said quietly, there's something else you should know. The deep archive records suggest that humanity's role in these events wasn't entirely coincidental. The temporal patterns that led to your species being chosen for trial, the specific timing of the rogue planet's arrival, the exact combination of factors that allowed you to access the restricted information. It appears that some faction of your descendants, working from a timeline we can't detect, may have orchestrated events to ensure the Tribunal's downfall. Sura stared at the transformed station, considering the implications. If Zephyr was right, then somewhere in humanity's future, their descendants had found a way to fight the Tribunal across time itself, using their own trial as a weapon against cosmic tyranny. A temporal rebellion that spanned millions of years, she murmured. Our descendants didn't just cause the extinction event. They used it as cover for inserting the very anomalies that would eventually bring down the system that was manipulating them. It's only a theory based on quantum resonance patterns, Zephyr cautioned. But the mathematical elegance is remarkable. If true, it suggests that even under the Tribunal's control, some civilizations found ways to resist across deep time. As the day's cycle progressed, and the transformed station continued its journey through space, Sura found herself filled with hope for the galaxy's future. The rigid order imposed by cosmic judges had been replaced by something far more chaotic, but infinitely more alive. A community of species learning to navigate the dangers of temporal manipulation together. There would be mistakes, certainly. Young civilizations would create paradoxes that required careful correction. Conflicts would arise between species with different philosophies about time travel. Some groups might even attempt to recreate the Tribunal's parasitic model. But for the first time in nearly 1 billion years, the galaxy was free to make those mistakes and learn from them naturally. The garden of time that surrounded them was wild and dangerous, but it was growing according to its own nature rather than being shaped by the needs of parasitic entities. Standing on the observation deck, watching ships from 1,000 different civilizations working together in the space around the liberated station, Sura realized that they had accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. They had proven that justice was stronger than tyranny, that cooperation was more powerful than control, and that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be overcome by beings willing to work together across the vast distances of space and time. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges that no single species could face alone. But whatever came next, the galaxy would meet it as a community of equals rather than subjects of cosmic judges. And that, Sura thought, made all the risks worthwhile. In the distance, the rogue planet that had carried judgment to their solar system continued its journey through the cosmos. But now it carried something far more precious, the possibility of a future shaped by wisdom earned rather than limitations imposed, by choices made freely rather than fates decreed by powers that claimed authority over time itself. The Skyborn Tribunal was gone, but the sky remained filled with infinite possibilities.